Welcome viewers to a difficult but necessary exploration of history's hidden shadows, the stories rarely printed in textbooks, yet etched into personal diaries, court testimonies, and whispered memories. Between 1933 and 1945, while the Nazi regime projected images of discipline, purity, and absolute control, darker allegations and documented cruelties lingered behind closed doors. Figures such as Heinrich Himmler and other high-ranking officials cultivated public personas of rigid morality, even as survivors and post-war investigations revealed disturbing contradictions. In the ruins of Berlin after 1945, scattered records, letters, and tribunal transcripts began to expose patterns of exploitation that had long been buried beneath propaganda and fear. These accounts are not presented for shock, but for understanding reminders that tyranny often disguises itself in ceremony and slogans while violating the very ideals it claims to defend. Tonight, we look beyond uniforms and speeches to confront uncomfortable truths, because history's silence can be as dangerous as its noise. On the evening of the 30th of January 1933, torchlight parades snaked through the streets of Berlin. Adolf Hitler had just been appointed Chancellor of Germany, and his brownshirted followers, the Sturmabteilung, or SA, celebrated with a display of pageantry designed to project an image of unstoppable power. To the cheering crowds, this was the dawn of national renewal. To those who understood what the Nazi Party had already become behind closed doors, it was something far darker. The moment an organization built on violence, secrecy, and the ruthless protection of its own was handed the machinery of an entire state. The conditions that would enable personal misconduct by Nazi leaders on a systematic scale did not emerge suddenly with the horrors of the concentration camps or the invasion of Poland. They were woven into the very fabric of the movement from its earliest days, rooted in an ideology that celebrated domination, demanded absolute loyalty, and treated human beings as instruments of racial and political will. To understand how the Nazi Party created an environment of near-total impunity for its leaders, one must look back to the chaotic years of the Weimar Republic. The party that Hitler refounded in 1925, after his release from Landsberg prison, was not merely a political organization. It was a paramilitary cult of personality, structured around the Führerprinzip, the leadership principle, which held that authority flowed downward from the leader and obedience flowed upward without question. Every member owed personal loyalty, not to a constitution or a set of laws, but to Hitler himself, and through him, to the chain of command that extended into every corner of party life. This was not an abstraction. Party members swore oaths. SS recruits, from 1926 onward, pledged their loyalty unto death. The culture this created was one in which questioning a superior about anything, including personal conduct, was not merely discouraged but understood as a form of betrayal. When powerful men operate within a system that equates obedience with virtue and dissent with treason, the space for accountability collapses entirely. The ideology that animated the movement made this collapse not just structural but moral. National Socialism was, at its core, a worldview built on hierarchies of domination. The racial ideology articulated in Hitler's Mein Kampf and elaborated by theorists like Alfred Rosenberg divided humanity into categories of worth, with the so-called Aryan race at the apex, and Jews, Roma, Slavic peoples, and others consigned to the status of Untermenschen subhumans. This was not merely political rhetoric. It was a framework that systematically stripped entire populations of their humanity in the eyes of those who held power. When a regime teaches its followers that certain people are not fully human, it removes the psychological and moral barriers that ordinarily restrain behavior. The dehumanization that would later manifest in the gas chambers of Auschwitz and the killing fields of Eastern Europe began as an idea, and that idea made every form of exploitation, including personal exploitation, not only possible but, in the twisted logic of the regime, unremarkable. Parallel to this racial ideology ran a cult of hyper-masculinity that permeated Nazi culture from top to bottom. The ideal Nazi man was a warrior, a conqueror, a figure of physical strength and unyielding will. Propaganda films like Leni Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will, released in 1935, glorified massed ranks of uniformed men marching in perfect synchronization, an aesthetic of power that left no room for vulnerability, empathy, or restraint. The SS, under Heinrich Himmler's direction, cultivated an image of themselves as a racial and masculine elite. Himmler's speeches to SS officers are filled with references to hardness, ruthlessness, and the suppression of what he called weakness. In his infamous Posen speech of the 4th of October 1943, he praised his men for having remained decent while carrying out mass murder, a perverse redefinition of decency that reveals how completely the regime had inverted ordinary moral language. In such an environment, personal aggression was not an aberration from the culture of the organization, it was an extension of it. Domination over bodies, whether through forced labor, medical experimentation, or personal violence, was simply another expression of the absolute power that the regime claimed over those it deemed inferior. The internal culture of the Nazi Party was also defined by an extraordinary apparatus of secrecy and mutual protection. The SS, in particular, operated as a state within a state, with its own courts, its own intelligence service, the Sicherheitsdienst, or SD, under Reinhard Heydrich, and its own codes of conduct that prioritized loyalty to the organization above all else. When scandals involving prominent party members did surface, the regime's first instinct was suppression, not accountability. One of the most revealing early cases involved Ernst Röhm, the head of the SA and one of Hitler's oldest allies. Röhm's homosexuality was an open secret within the party throughout the late 1920s and early 1930s, and his opponents, both inside and outside the Nazi movement, attempted to use it against him. Social Democrats published letters in which Röhm discussed his intimate relationships with men. Yet Hitler protected Röhm for years, declaring that the SA leader's private life was his own affair, not because Hitler was tolerant, but because Röhm was useful. It was only when Röhm became a political threat that Hitler acted, ordering his murder during the Night of the Long Knives on the 30th of June, 1934, and even then, the public justification focused on alleged treason, not private conduct. The lesson was unmistakable. In the Nazi system, personal behavior was shielded from scrutiny as long as the individual served the regime's interests, and it was weaponized only when politically convenient. This pattern of selective impunity extended to numerous other figures. Julius Streicher, the Gauleiter of Franconia and publisher of the virulently anti-Semitic newspaper Der Stürmer, was the subject of persistent rumors and formal complaints regarding improper conduct, including allegations of coercive misconduct, the exploitation of confiscated Jewish property for personal indulgence, and sadistic behavior toward prisoners. A party investigation in 1940, led by a commission that included SS judges, substantiated many of these allegations. Streicher was stripped of his position as Gauleiter, but he was never criminally prosecuted, never expelled from the party, and continued to publish Der Stürmer with Hitler's blessing until the end of the war. His case illustrates a crucial dynamic. The Nazi system could acknowledge the misconduct of its members internally while ensuring that no genuine consequences followed, because the system itself depended on the loyalty and complicity of those very members. The legal and social environment of 1930s Germany made it virtually impossible for victims to challenge this culture of impunity. After the Reichstag fire decree of the 28th of February, 1933, and the Enabling Act of the 23rd of March, 1933, the Nazi regime dismantled the constitutional protections of the Weimar Republic with breathtaking speed. An independent judiciary ceased to exist. The Gestapo, established in April 1933 under Hermann Göring and later absorbed into the SS apparatus, operated outside any legal oversight with the explicit authority to detain individuals without charge or trial. By 1936, a Prussian administrative court ruled that the actions of the Gestapo were not subject to judicial review, a legal doctrine that effectively placed the secret police, and by extension the regime's leadership, above the law. For any victim of cruelty by a Nazi official, the question was not merely whether they would be believed, but whether the act of speaking out would itself be treated as a crime. Criticizing a party leader could be construed as undermining the state. For Jews, political dissidents and other targeted groups, the danger was existential. A complaint could lead not to investigation of the perpetrator, but to the deportation or execution of the complainant. Even among so-called Aryan German citizens, the social pressures against disclosure were immense. The Nazi regime had reshaped German civil society through a process known as Gleichschaltung coordination, which brought every institution, from labor unions to churches to women's organizations, under party control or influence. The Nationalsozialistische Frauenschaft, the Nazi Women's League, promoted an image of German womanhood centered on motherhood, obedience, and service to the folk. Women were celebrated as bearers of the race, not as individuals with rights or agency. In such a climate, a woman who accused a powerful party official of personal cruelty would have found no institutional support, no independent press willing to publish her story, and no legal system capable of holding her cruelty accountable. The regime had not merely created conditions in which cruelty could occur, it had systematically dismantled every mechanism by which cruelty could be reported, investigated, or punished. The consolidation of this culture was neither accidental nor incidental to the Nazi project. It was a feature of the system, not a bug. Authoritarian regimes depend on the complicity of their members, and complicity is most effectively secured when those members are themselves compromised. The historian Robert Gellertly has argued that the Nazi state functioned in part through a web of mutual surveillance, denunciation, and shared guilt that bound individuals to the regime more tightly than ideology alone ever could. When officials engaged in corruption, brutality, or personal exploitation, they became more dependent on the regime's protection, and therefore more loyal to it. Himmler understood this dynamic intuitively. His establishment of the concentration camp brothel system in 1942, which forced women prisoners into servitude for the supposed benefit of male prisoner laborers, was administered through official SS channels with bureaucratic precision. The paperwork, the selections, the transfers, all of it was documented just enough to maintain organizational control while remaining hidden from public view. The system was designed to exploit while maintaining the appearance of order, to commit atrocities while leaving as few fingerprints as possible. By the time Germany plunged into war in September 1939, the architecture of cruelty was fully constructed. The party's authoritarian structure ensured that power flowed without checks. Its ideology provided the moral justification for treating entire categories of human beings as objects. Its internal culture of secrecy and loyalty shielded perpetrators from consequences. Its legal apparatus had eliminated any independent avenue for redress. And its propaganda machine had reshaped public consciousness to such a degree that domination was celebrated as strength and submission was demanded as duty. What followed in the camps, the occupied territories, and the dark rooms of the Reich's institutions was not a departure from the system the Nazis had built, it was its fulfillment. In the spring of 1945, as Allied forces swept across Germany and into the remnants of the Nazi Empire, liberating soldiers encountered scenes that defied comprehension. The skeletal survivors of Bergen-Belsen, the gas chambers of Auschwitz-Birkenau, the mass graves of Treblinka, these horrors entered the historical record immediately, captured by military photographers and newsreel cameras, their reality undeniable. But among the survivors stumbling into freedom were thousands of men and women carrying a different kind of wound, one that would not appear in the liberation photographs and would take decades to enter the historical conversation. They were survivors of personal violence, and their stories, though no less real than the images of the camps, would remain largely unspoken for generations. The documented record of personal cruelty within the Nazi system is fragmentary, suppressed, and haunted by silence. But what has survived in testimonies, in archival documents, in the physical evidence of the camps themselves, reveals a machinery of systematic exploitation that was not incidental to the Nazi project, but deeply embedded within it. The most systematically documented form of personal exploitation in the concentration camp system was the network of camp brothels established under the direct authority of Heinrich Himmler. In 1942, Himmler ordered the creation of what were euphemistically called Sonderbauten special buildings within selected concentration camps. The stated purpose was to increase the productivity of male prisoner laborers by offering access to a brothel as a reward for meeting work quotas. Between 1942 and 1945, at least 10 such brothels were established in camps, including Mauthausen, Buchenwald, Sachsenhausen, Dachau, Neuengamme, Flossenbürg, and Auschwitz-Monowitz. The women forced to work in these brothels were primarily drawn from the Ravensbrück concentration camp, the largest camp for female prisoners. They were told they would be released after 6 months of service, a promise that was almost never kept. Some had been coerced through false promises of improved conditions. Others were simply selected by SS officers and given no choice at all. Historian Robert Sommer, whose 2009 study Das KZ Bordell remains the most comprehensive account of this system, estimated that approximately 200 women were forced into servitude across these facilities. The SS maintained bureaucratic records of the brothel's schedules, medical inspections, transfer documents, with the same chilling administrative precision they applied to every other aspect of the camp system. These documents, many of which survived in fragmentary form in the archives of the Arolsen Archives, formerly the International Tracing Service, reveal that the exploitation was not chaotic or opportunistic but organized, sanctioned, and managed from the highest levels of the SS hierarchy. The brothel system, however, represents only one dimension of the violence that pervaded the camps. Individual acts of private, personal torture and degrading humiliation by SS guards and camp officials are documented across numerous survivor testimonies, though they were rarely reported in systematic fashion. At Ravensbrück, survivors described guards who selected young women for personal exploitation, threatening death or transfer to the gas chambers for refusal. Testimony collected by Soviet investigators after the liberation of the camp in April 1945 includes accounts of SS officers who assaulted prisoners during interrogations or as a form of punishment. At Auschwitz, the testimony of survivors like Suarina Smaglewska, whose 1945 memoir, Smoke over Birkenau, was among the first published accounts of life in the camp, alluded to the personal violence women faced from both guards and privileged male prisoners, though, as was common in the immediate post-war years, the details were often veiled in euphemism, reflecting the profound shame that victims carried even after liberation. In the occupied territories, personal violence took on additional dimensions shaped by the racial ideology of the regime. On the Eastern Front, where the war against the Soviet Union was framed explicitly as a war of racial annihilation, German soldiers and SS units committed widespread cruelty against civilian women and girls. Though the Wehrmacht officially prohibited acts of intimate private, not out of concern for victims but to prevent racial contamination between German soldiers and Slavic or Jewish women, enforcement was inconsistent and often non-existent. Historian Birgit Beck's research into German military court records has revealed that while some soldiers were prosecuted for intimate private, sentences were frequently lenient, and many cases were never brought to trial at all. The regime's concern was not the suffering of the victim but the perceived racial transgression of the perpetrator. In a perverse inversion of justice, the intimate private of a Jewish woman by a German soldier could theoretically be punished as a breach of the Nuremberg race. Laws of 1935 laws designed to prevent personal contact between Aryans and Jews while the suffering of the woman herself was entirely irrelevant to the legal framework. This twisted logic meant that cruelty and violence against Jewish and Slavic women existed in a kind of legal no-man's land, technically forbidden for racial reasons, practically tolerated through indifference, and almost never prosecuted on behalf of the victim. The intersection of personal cruelty with the regime's broader programs of racial engineering adds another layer of horror to the documented record. The forced sterilization program, authorized under the Law for the Prevention of Hereditarily Diseased Offspring, enacted on the 14th of July, 1933, subjected an estimated 300,000 to 400,000 people to involuntary sterilization during the years of the Third Reich. The procedures were carried out in hospitals and clinics across Germany, often without the knowledge or meaningful consent of the victims, and disproportionately targeted people with disabilities, Roma, Black Germans, and those deemed asocial. For women, sterilization frequently involved invasive surgical procedures performed under conditions of coercion that constituted a form of personal violence in themselves. The invasion of bodily autonomy was the point the regime asserted the right to determine who could reproduce and who could not, reducing human beings to their reproductive capacity and then destroying it. In the concentration camps, this logic reached its most extreme expression in the medical experiments conducted by SS physicians. At Auschwitz, Dr. Karl Klauberg conducted experiments in mass sterilization on Jewish and Roma women, injecting caustic substances into their uteruses without anesthesia to develop a method of sterilizing large populations quickly and cheaply. Survivors of Klauberg's experiments described excruciating pain, permanent injury, and the dehumanizing conditions under which they were treated, lined up, examined, injected, and discarded. Dr. Joseph Mengele, whose name has become synonymous with the horrors of Nazi medical experimentation, conducted his own experiments on twins and other prisoners that frequently involved the exposure and manipulation of reproductive organs. Testimony from survivors like Eva Moses Kor, who with her twin sister Miriam was subjected to Mengele's experiments as a child at Auschwitz, described procedures that blurred the line between medical torture and personal cruelty. "We were treated like animals," Kor stated in interviews decades later, "worse than animals, because at least animals are not experimented on by people who smile while they do it." The medical experiments were documented in reports that the perpetrators themselves produced, some of which survived the war and were presented as evidence at the Nuremberg doctors' trial of 1946–1947, where 23 defendants were tried for crimes, including non-consensual experimentation. Yet even in that trial, the specifically personal nature of many of the cruelties were subsumed under the broader category of medical crimes, leaving the personal aspect of the cruelty largely unnamed in the legal proceedings. Beyond the camps and the laboratories, individual Nazi leaders engaged in patterns of personal misconduct of an intimate nature that were shielded by the regime's culture of impunity. Julius Streicher, the publisher of Der Stürmer, was investigated by a Nazi Party commission in 1940 on charges that included personal coercion and the confiscation of Jewish property for personal use. Witnesses testified that Streicher had boasted of personally degrading Jewish prisoners and had exploited his position of absolute regional authority to prey on vulnerable individuals. The commission found many of the allegations credible, yet Streicher faced no criminal consequences. Oskar Dirlewanger, the commander of the notorious SS Sonderbataillon Dirlewanger, had been convicted of the cruelty of a minor before the war, a conviction that, remarkably, did not prevent his recruitment into the SS and his eventual command of a unit that committed some of the most barbaric atrocities of the conflict, including mass cruelty during the suppression of the Warsaw Uprising in August 1944. Dirlewanger's unit was so violent that even other SS commanders complained about its conduct, yet the unit continued to operate with the regime's blessing, a testament to how completely the structures of accountability had been dismantled. The testimony of survivors, painstakingly collected over decades by organizations such as the USC Shoah Foundation, Yad Vashem, and the Fortunoff Video Archive for Holocaust Testimonies at Yale University, has been indispensable in filling the gaps left by destroyed documents and suppressed records. Yet historians who work with this material confront profound methodological and ethical challenges. Memories recorded decades after the events are shaped by the passage of time, by the psychological mechanisms of trauma, and by the cultural contexts in which survivors found themselves after the war. Many survivors gave their first testimonies only in the 1980s or 1990s, after decades of silence, and the accounts they offered sometimes conflicted with one another or with the fragmentary documentary record. This does not mean their testimonies are unreliable, but it requires historians to approach them with both empathy and rigor, cross-referencing accounts wherever possible, and acknowledging the limits of what can be definitively established. The historian Atina Grossman, whose work on the aftermath of the war in occupied Germany has examined the experiences of displaced persons and survivors, has written about the layered silences that surround personal violence in the Holocaust, silences imposed by perpetrators, by post-war societies eager to move on, and by survivors themselves, for whom the act of speaking about personal cruelty carried a burden of shame that even the passage of decades could not fully lift. The destruction of evidence compounds these challenges enormously. The SS, under Himmler's orders, destroyed vast quantities of records as the war drew to a close. At Ravensbrück, camp administrators burned documents for days before the arrival of Soviet forces. At Auschwitz, the retreating SS demolished crematoria and attempted to destroy administrative records, though the sheer scale of the camp's bureaucracy meant that significant portions survived. What remains is enough to establish the broad outlines of the systems of exploitation, the brothel network, the sterilization programs, the medical experiments, but insufficient to reconstruct the full scope of individual experiences. For every testimony that was recorded, countless others were lost to death, to silence, or to the simple passage of time. The fragments that survive a name on a transfer list, a line in a survivor's memoir, a notation in an SS doctor's report, are windows into a reality that can never be fully reconstructed, but that demands, nonetheless, to be acknowledged. When the gates of the International Military Tribunal swung open in Nuremberg on the 20th of November 1945, the world expected justice. 22 of the most powerful men in Nazi Germany sat in the dock, facing charges of crimes against peace, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and conspiracy. The prosecution teams from the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Soviet Union had spent months assembling mountains of evidence, documents stamped with swastikas, photographs of mass graves, testimonies from hollow-eyed survivors. Yet for all the meticulous effort to catalogue the horrors of the Third Reich, one enormous category of atrocity remained almost entirely absent from the proceedings: personal violence. This was not because personal crimes had not occurred. They had occurred on a staggering, systematic scale. Coerced exploitation in concentration camp brothels, cruelty in occupied territories from France to the Soviet Union, abusive torture in interrogation rooms, the grotesque cruelties carried out under the guise of medical experimentation by figures like Josef Mengele at Auschwitz, all of this was known, whispered about, even occasionally documented. But when Chief Prosecutor Robert H. Jackson delivered his famous opening statement, declaring that the wrongs which we seek to condemn and punish have been so calculated, so malignant, and so devastating that civilization cannot tolerate their being ignored, the specific wrong of personal cruelty was, in practice, largely ignored. Understanding why requires stepping into the legal and cultural landscape of the 1940s. International humanitarian law at the time was rudimentary when it came to acts of cruelty. The 1907 Hague Conventions referenced the protection of family honor and rights, a vague phrase that reflected an era in which intimate private was understood less as a crime against an individual's bodily autonomy and more as a stain on family or national honor. The Geneva Conventions of 1949 which would later provide stronger language about the protection of women from intimate private, compelled exploitation, or any form of indecent intimate private, came after the Nuremberg trials had already concluded. Prosecutors at Nuremberg therefore worked within a framework that simply did not prioritize personal misconduct offenses as distinct, prosecutable atrocities. Acts of cruelty were, at best, folded into the broader category of ill treatment or inhumane acts, stripped of its specific horror and rendered invisible in the legal record. There was also the problem of evidence, or rather, the deliberate destruction of it. As the Reich collapsed in the spring of 1945, Nazi officials engaged in a frantic campaign to burn documents, dismantle camp records, and eliminate witnesses. Heinrich Himmler, the architect of the SS and the concentration camp system, ordered the destruction of vast quantities of paperwork before his capture and subsequent ended their lives on the 23rd of May 1945. The records of the Ravensbrück concentration camp, the largest camp primarily for women, were particularly targeted. Camp brothels established under the so-called Sonderbau system, a program initiated by Himmler himself in 1942 to incentivize prisoner labor through forced personal exploitation, were documented in internal SS communications, but many of those communications were lost in the fires. What survived was fragmentary, and prosecutors understandably focused on the crimes for which evidence was most overwhelming: genocide, slave labor, and aggressive war. But evidence destruction alone does not explain the silence. A deeper, more uncomfortable truth lies in the stigma that surrounded cruelty-related trauma in mid-20th century society. Survivors of personal cruelty in the camps faced an impossible bind. Speaking publicly about what had been done to them meant confronting not only their own trauma, but the judgment of a world that often equated victimhood with shame. Women who had been forced into camp brothels were sometimes regarded with suspicion by fellow survivors and by post-war communities. Were they collaborators? Had they volunteered? These cruel questions, born of ignorance and the pervasive tendency to blame victims, kept countless stories buried for decades. The German Jewish philosopher Hannah Arendt, reporting on the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem in 1961, observed how difficult it was for survivors to testify about any aspect of their dehumanization, and cruelty-related trauma carried an additional, paralyzing layer of silence. Men, too, were victims. Though their experiences have been even more thoroughly erased from the historical record, cruelty of male prisoners, particularly gay men, imprisoned under paragraph 175 of the German Penal Code, was widespread but almost never discussed in post-war testimonies or trials. The legal persecution of homosexuality continued in both East and West Germany after 1945, meaning that male survivors of personal violations in the camps faced potential criminal prosecution simply for acknowledging their identities. It was not until 2002 that the German government formally recognized gay victims of the Holocaust, and even then, the specific dimension of personal cruelty remained largely unaddressed. Historians have grappled with these silences for decades, and the scholarly landscape has shifted considerably since the pioneering work of researchers like Helga Ammersberger, Katrin Auer, and Brigitte Halbmeier, whose study of female survivors of Ravensbrück in the early 2000s brought the subject of cruelty in the camps into sharper academic focus. Robert Sommer's 2009 book, Das KZ Bordell, The Concentration Camp Brothel, provided the first comprehensive examination of the Sonderbau system, drawing on surviving documents and testimonies to reconstruct a program that had been almost entirely absent from Holocaust historiography. These works challenged a long-standing reluctance within the field to address cruelty and trauma directly, a reluctance rooted partly in respect for survivors' privacy and partly in a fear of sensationalism. As historian Dagmar Herzog has argued, writing about intimacy and the Third Reich requires navigating a minefield of ethical considerations. How does one tell these stories without reducing victims to their suffering, without feeding prurient curiosity, and without inadvertently reproducing the dehumanization that the Nazis themselves inflicted. The debate over myth versus fact adds another layer of complexity. Over the decades, sensationalized accounts of Nazi moral corruption have proliferated in popular culture, from the exploitation films of the 1970s, like Ilse, She-Wolf of the SS, to tabloid-style books that blur the line between historical analysis and voyeurism. These portrayals have, paradoxically, made it harder for serious historians to be heard. When the public imagination is saturated with lurid fictions, genuine scholarly findings about documented cruelty can be dismissed as just another exaggeration, or worse, they can be co-opted by those who seek to titillate rather than educate. The challenge for researchers and filmmakers alike is to insist on evidentiary rigor while honoring the gravity of what survivors endured. The psychological legacy of these crimes extends far beyond the survivors themselves. Research into intergenerational trauma, much of it pioneered by clinicians working with Holocaust survivor families, has demonstrated that the effects of extreme cruelty do not end with the generation that experienced it directly. The work of psychiatrists like Dina Wardi, who coined the term memorial candles to describe children of survivors who carry the emotional burden of their parents' unspoken suffering, has shown how silence itself becomes a form of transmission. When personal cruelty is the specific trauma that remains unspoken because the survivor could never find the words, or the audience, or the safety to speak, the distortion in family systems can be profound. Children and grandchildren of survivors have reported patterns of anxiety, distrust, difficulties with intimacy, and a pervasive sense of carrying a grief they cannot name. The Nuremberg trials, for all their limitations, established a principle that would eventually grow to encompass the crimes they overlooked. The idea that individuals, not just states, could be held accountable for atrocities committed during wartime laid the groundwork for the development of international criminal law over the following half-century. It took decades, but the tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda in the 1990s finally and acts of cruelty as instruments of genocide and crimes against humanity. The landmark 1998 judgment against Jean-Paul Akayesu by the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda marked the first time in history that cruelty-based crimes were prosecuted as an act of genocide. The Rome Statute, which established the International Criminal Court in 2002, explicitly listed rape, servitude, enforced prostitution, forced pregnancy, and enforced sterilization among its enumerated crimes against humanity and war crimes. These legal advances owe a debt to the failures of Nuremberg and to the historians, activists, and survivors who spent decades insisting that what happened in the camps and occupied territories was not a footnote to the real atrocities but an atrocity in its own right. The lesson is not simply that acts of cruelty must be documented and prosecuted, though it must. The deeper lesson is about the architecture of impunity, how authoritarian systems create conditions in which cruelty flourishes precisely because structures of accountability have been dismantled. Witnesses have been silenced, and the powerful have rewritten the rules to protect themselves. Every modern effort to document war crimes, to protect whistleblowers, to support survivors in coming forward, and to ensure that international legal frameworks have teeth rather than just words on paper is, in some sense, a response to what went unaddressed in the smoke-filled courtroom at Nuremberg 80 years ago. And as we close this unsettling chapter, we are reminded that the crimes of the Nazi era were not confined to battlefields or borders, but also hid in private rooms and cruelted positions of absolute power between 1933 and 1945. Behind polished uniforms and grand speeches, figures within the regime carried secrets that revealed the darkest capacities of unchecked authority and silence. History does not whisper these truths, it preserves them as warnings. As Elie Wiesel once said, neutrality helps the oppressor, never the victim. May remembrance remain louder than denial.